In the unfolding of time, God orchestrates every moment with divine precision. The waiting has not been in vain, for it has prepared you for a nearing breakthrough, a financial blessing set to manifest in its perfect season. This is no mere coincidence, but the unfolding of a divine plan, crafted by the one who sees the beginning and the end. Your hardships and struggles have not gone unnoticed. They have been part of the process, refining your spirit and preparing you for a prosperity that will change your life. This is not just a fleeting moment of wealth, but a permanent shift, a transformational journey from lack to abundance. Trust in God's promises, for what is to come will be undeniable. His love is woven into every blessing, and soon you will witness the fruits of your faithfulness, not only in material gain, but in peace, stability, and fulfillment that extend far beyond the financial realm. The appointed hour, a tale of divine provision. Jonah sat on the worn wooden bench outside his small tailor shop, staring at the cobbled streets of Jerusalem. Business had been slow, too slow. His debts loomed like storm clouds, and his faith, once unshakable, wavered beneath the weight of uncertainty. He had prayed, pleaded, and waited, but God seemed silent. He sighed as he watched the merchants pass by, their carts laden with goods. "Perhaps," he murmured, "God has forgotten me." A voice interrupted his despair. "Why do you sit here, burdened by shadows?" Jonah turned. An old man, wrapped in a simple robe, stood before him. His eyes, though ancient, burned with something more than age. Wisdom, perhaps, or a light not of this world. "I have been waiting for God to answer my prayers," Jonah admitted. The old man smiled. "And what if he has already answered, but you have not yet seen?" Jonah frowned. "I see only empty pockets and unpaid debts." The stranger chuckled. "Then perhaps you are looking in the wrong place." He handed Jonah a small, folded parchment and disappeared into the crowd. Jonah hesitated before unfolding the note. It read, "Go to the eastern gate at dusk. There you will see the hand of God." A test of faith. Jonah had nothing left to lose. That evening he stood by the eastern gate, uncertain and anxious. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the city. Then, from the distance, a commotion arose. A caravan, wealthy traders from Damascus, approached the gate, their camels laden with silk and spices. Jonah barely noticed them until one of the traders, a man richly dressed yet visibly distressed, dismounted and cried out, "Is there a tailor among you?" Jonah stepped forward hesitantly. "I am a tailor." The man's face lit up with relief. "A disaster has befallen us. The robes for the governor's banquet have been ruined in our journey. We need a skilled hand to mend them before dawn. Are you able?" Jonah nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, I can." The trader clasped his hands together. "If you can restore them by sunrise, we will reward you handsomely." Jonah barely slept that night. He worked by candlelight, his needle moving with a precision that felt almost guided. The fabrics were fine, the damage severe, yet he felt something stir within him with every stitch. Peace. By dawn, the robes were flawless. The trader, upon seeing them, was overjoyed. "You have saved us." He pressed a heavy pouch into Jonah's hands. The weight of it told him what he already suspected. Gold. More than enough to pay his debts, more than enough to begin again. As the caravan departed, Jonah stood in awe. His financial breakthrough had not come as he expected. No sudden miracle, no coin from a fish's mouth, but through his own hands, blessed by divine timing. The old man's words returned to him. "What if he has already answered, but you have not yet seen?" Jonah knelt on the ground, overwhelmed. God had not abandoned him. The waiting had never been in vain. The provision had always been there, waiting for the appointed hour. And at that moment, Jonah understood. Faith was not just about waiting for miracles, it was about walking toward them. The unseen harvest. Jonathan stood at the edge of his barren field, the soil dry and cracked beneath his feet. He had labored under the sun for years, tilling, sowing, and praying. Yet the harvest never came. Each season ended in disappointment. Each prayer seemed to vanish into the silent sky. His faith wavered and doubt gnawed at him. Was God even listening? One evening, an old man approached. As he sat under the lone oak tree at the field's edge, his eyes gleamed with wisdom and his voice carried a quiet strength. "You are troubled," the man said. Jonathan sighed. "I have given everything. My hands are calloused, my back aches, and my soul is weary." "Yet God remains silent," the old man nodded. "You believe he has been idle, that he has turned away. But the unseen hand of the Lord is never still." Jonathan frowned. "Then why has my labor yielded nothing?" The man knelt and took a handful of the dry earth, letting it slip through his fingers. "You see barrenness, but God sees preparation. What if I told you the land was not ready, that the soil was being refined deep below the surface?" Jonathan scoffed. "That sounds like another way of saying keep waiting. But I have waited, I have trusted, and still, nothing." The old man's gaze did not waver. What if the delay was not about the land, but about you? Jonathan fell silent. The old man continued, "God's blessings are not just about the harvest. He is making you into someone who can carry his abundance. If prosperity had come when you were impatient, would you have been wise with it? If wealth had come before gratitude, would you have cherished it?" Jonathan pondered this. He had seen men blessed beyond measure only to squander their gifts. He had envied them, but now he wondered, had they been ready for what they received? The old man stood. "A great shift is coming, but you must be prepared to receive it." Jonathan watched as he walked away, his words echoing in his mind. That night he prayed, not for immediate abundance, but for patience, wisdom, and readiness. The next morning, rain came. For the first time in years, the ground drank deeply. Weeks passed, and where there had been only cracked soil, green shoots emerged. The land that had seemed cursed now burst with life. The harvest that came was greater than he had ever imagined, but more than that, his heart was changed. He no longer saw waiting as punishment but as preparation. The struggle had not been wasted. It had formed him, and as he stood in the midst of his flourishing fields, he understood. God had seen his every tear, heard his every prayer, and had been working all along. The blessings had been ready. He simply had to be ready for them. Years later, Jonathan became a mentor to other struggling farmers, sharing the wisdom he had gained. He taught them not only how to cultivate their fields, but how to cultivate their faith. Many came to him seeking advice, and he would tell them the same words the old man had told him. God's timing is perfect. The delay is not denial, it is preparation. One day, a young farmer came to Jonathan, much like he once had, with hands rough from labor and a heart heavy with disappointment. "I have prayed, I have worked, yet nothing changes. Does God even care?" Jonathan smiled gently and led the young man to the oak tree where he had once sat in despair. "Let me tell you a story," he said. And so he began to recount his own journey, the years of toil, the moments of doubt, and the eventual overwhelming blessings. As the young man listened, something shifted in his heart. For the first time in a long while, he saw hope, and so the cycle continued. Faith passed down through generations, like seeds planted in fertile soil, waiting for their time to bloom. The 11th hour, a call to faith and abundance. In the great unfolding of history, there are moments when the heavens seem to whisper, when the divine message is not merely heard but felt in the depths of the soul. These are the moments when time itself seems to pause. What some might call the 11th hour. It is a time of urgency, of decision and of transformation. And for those who choose to listen, it is a time of divine abundance. The scriptures are filled with stories of those who encountered God in their own 11th hour. Consider the Israelites trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army with no escape in sight. To human eyes, it was the end, but to God, it was only the beginning. At the final moment when fear gripped their hearts, Moses lifted his staff and the waters parted. Exodus 14:21. What seemed like impending destruction became deliverance. Or take Elijah, standing alone on Mount Carmel, surrounded by prophets of Baal, as the people of Israel wavered in their faith. The challenge was set: let the true God answer with fire. The false prophets cried out for hours, yet the heavens remained silent. Then Elijah, with unwavering confidence, prayed a simple prayer, and fire fell from the sky. 1 Kings 18:38. In that instant, the people saw with their own eyes the power of God, and their hearts were turned back to Him. These stories are not relics of the past, they are mirrors reflecting our own spiritual journey. How often do we find ourselves at the brink, uncertain of the future, unsure whether God hears us? How often do we stand at the water's edge, with no clear path forward? And yet, the message is clear. The 11th hour is not too late for God. It is the moment when He moves most powerfully. But faith is not a passive thing. Just as Moses had to raise his staff and Elijah had to call upon the Lord, so too are we called to action. Engagement with the message of God, through prayer, through study, through community, is not just a suggestion, it is the key to unlocking divine abundance. When we declare our faith openly, when we participate actively, we align ourselves with His plan. There is a peculiar symbolism in the number 11. In the world's eyes, it may seem ordinary, but in the realm of faith, it signifies alignment with God's purpose. The 11th hour is not a time of despair, but of awakening. It is the moment just before breakthrough, the final test before the victory. Those who recognize this are those who receive the blessings that await. Jesus Himself spoke of the 11th hour workers in His parable, Matthew 20, verse 1 through 16. The vineyard owner called laborers throughout the day, yet those hired last, at the 11th hour, received the same reward as those who had labored since morning. It was a message of divine generosity, of grace that is not measured by human standards. The blessings of God do not operate on earthly schedules. They come in His perfect time. For those who seek hope for the future, the call is simple: engage, participate, expect. Do not stand idly by, waiting for blessings to fall upon you like rain. Step forward in faith, declare God's promises, and believe that even in the 11th hour, He is working. The act of engaging, whether through prayer, community, or even the smallest step of faith, strengthens the connection between the heart and the divine. To those who feel forgotten, know this: the hour is not yet past. To those who wonder if God still moves, remember the parted sea, the fire from heaven, the empty tomb. The same God who worked wonders then is the God who calls you now. He is not limited by time, nor is He bound by human understanding. He is the God of the 11th hour, and He is never late. God's plan for abundance. In the quiet corners of the world, where the weary sigh and the hopeful dream, there exists a truth often forgotten. God's nature is one of abundance. It is not a mere sentiment, but a reality woven into the very fabric of creation. From the birds of the air to the lilies of the field, His provision is evident. And yet, how often do His children fall into despair, fearing that scarcity is their lot? The story of Joseph is a testimony to this truth. Sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, he endured trials that would have broken a lesser man, but God had set aside a treasure for him, one that was unseen in his suffering. Through years of waiting, Joseph's faith was tested, his character refined, and his trust in God deepened. When the moment came, he was not only elevated to power in Egypt, but became the instrument through which many were saved from famine. What seemed like a path of ruin was, in fact, the road to abundance. So it is with those who trust in God's plan. Hardships are not the final chapter. They are merely the proving ground for greater blessings. The struggles of today, financial burdens, closed doors, disappointments, are not permanent afflictions, but temporary trials. They are not evidence of God's neglect, but of His preparation. For every wilderness has its end, and every desert gives way to the promised land. Yet, abundance in God's kingdom is more than mere wealth. It is the expansion of opportunities, the growth of business ventures, the establishment of generational blessings. It is wisdom granted to make sound decisions, favor bestowed in unexpected places, and doors opened that no man can shut. And, perhaps most importantly, It is the peace that surpasses understanding, a treasure more valuable than gold. Consider the parable of the talents. The master did not distribute his wealth to be hoarded, but to be multiplied. Those who invested and stewarded well were given even more, while the one who buried his talent in fear lost even what he had. God's abundance is not for the idle. It is for the faithful. Those who move forward in trust, even when circumstances seem dire, will find that He has already laid the foundation for their increase. But why the waiting? Why the struggle? Because the waiting period is where faith is forged. It is where patience is cultivated, where trust is refined. The Israelites, before entering the land flowing with milk and honey, wandered the desert for 40 years, not because God had forgotten them, but because He was preparing them. The land was promised, but their hearts had to be readied to receive it. Faith, then, is the key. Not a vague hope, but a deep, unwavering trust in the God who provides. When Elijah stood before the widow at Zarephath, she had only a handful of flour and a little oil. To her it was the last meal before death. To God, it was the beginning of an unending supply. The oil did not run dry because she trusted. So, too, must we trust. Not in riches, not in fleeting securities, but in the One who holds all things in His hands. The abundance of God is not an illusion. It is a promise. And for those who wait upon Him, who move in faith rather than fear, the storehouses of heaven stand ready to pour forth blessings beyond measure. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29:11. Let the weary take heart. The struggle is not the end. The desert is not your home. The God of abundance has set aside treasures for you, waiting for the moment you are ready to receive them. Hold fast, believe, and in due time you will see the fullness of His provision, the treasure beyond sight. Jonah had never known abundance. His hands, calloused from years of labor, bore witness to a life of toil. Each day was a battle against scarcity, each night a prayer for provision. He had heard the stories, tales of divine wealth, of blessings poured out from heaven. Yet, as he looked at his modest home and empty table, doubt gnawed at his heart. Could such promises be for him? Or were they reserved for others, those more faithful, more fortunate? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonah wandered beyond his village, seeking solace in the quiet of the fields. There, beneath an ancient olive tree, he cried out, "Lord, have you forgotten me? Your word speaks of abundance, yet my hands remain empty." A voice, gentle yet firm, echoed in his spirit, "Look beyond what you see." At first, Jonah saw nothing, just the same parched ground, the same dusty road. But then, as if a veil had lifted, he noticed something. The tree under which he stood was laden with fruit. He had passed by it countless times and never truly seen it. The provision had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. In that moment, Jonah understood. Wealth was not merely gold in hand, but the opportunities God placed along his path. Some required faith to perceive, others required action to seize. But all were given freely to those who trusted in the giver. As he returned to his home, Jonah found himself reflecting on the stories of old. He thought of Abraham, who left everything behind to follow God's call, trusting in a promise yet unseen. He thought of Joseph, who endured the depths of prison before stepping into the wealth of Pharaoh's palace. And he thought of the widow in Zarephath, who, though she had only a handful of flour, obeyed Elijah's words and found her jar never empty. Wealth, Jonah realized, was not merely a possession, but a promise. It was not limited to the privileged few, but available to all who aligned themselves with God's purpose. The struggle was real, but it was never final. Present circumstances did not define the future, rather, faith did. Over the weeks that followed, Jonah began to walk differently, not merely with his feet, but with his heart. He no longer saw his work as mere survival, but as a field ripe for blessing. He took risks, invested wisely, and opened his hands instead of clenching them in fear. And as he did, the provision came, not all at once, not always as he expected, but always in abundance. One day, a traveler passing through the village spoke of a landowner seeking a steward for his estate. Someone honest, diligent, and faithful. Jonah's reputation had grown, and soon he found himself entrusted with more than he had ever imagined. The wealth he once longed for had arrived, not as a sudden miracle, but as the fruit of faith and obedience. Looking back, he understood what God had meant. Look beyond what you see. The treasure had always been near, waiting for him to recognize it, waiting for him to believe. And so, to those who stand where he once stood, to the weary, the uncertain, the ones who wonder if God's promises include them, Jonah's story is a whisper of hope. The promise of divine provision is not distant nor reserved for others. It is near, woven into the fabric of faith. All one must do is look beyond what is seen and step forward in trust. But the purpose of the waiting period. The young man paced restlessly along the shore, his feet kicking up grains of sand that had been shaped by countless tides. He had prayed, he had worked, and still the wealth he sought had not arrived. "Why does God delay?" he murmured, staring at the horizon, where sea and sky met in a golden haze. A voice, deep yet gentle, broke the silence. "Why do you sharpen a sword before battle?" Startled, the young man turned. Before him stood an old fisherman, his hands calloused from years of toil. The young man hesitated before answering. "Because a dull blade is useless in a fight." The fisherman nodded. "And why does the blacksmith refine gold in fire? To remove the impurities so that it is pure and strong." The old man smiled. "Then why do you question the waiting?" The young man opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. "The refinement process. Waiting is not punishment but preparation," the fisherman continued. "God does not withhold blessings, he strengthens the hands meant to carry them. Would you give a sword to a child, or place a fortune in the hands of one who cannot manage a single coin?" The young man frowned. "But I have worked hard, I have been faithful. Why must I still wait?" The old man knelt and drew a line in the sand. A seed is buried in darkness before it can sprout. A tree must weather storms before its roots grow deep. If wealth were given too soon, it would be a burden, not a blessing. The waiting period is the furnace in which faith is refined. The young man lowered his head, pondering the words. Had his trials been tests rather than punishments? Had he mistaken God's silence for absence rather than preparation? Personal growth before wealth. "Wealth is more than gold and silver," the fisherman said. "It is wisdom, patience, and strength. Would you rather be given riches that slip through your fingers, or the wisdom to manage them so they last beyond your years?" The young man thought of those he had seen squander their inheritance, of men who had gained everything yet lost their souls. "I want to be ready," he admitted. "I want to be wise." The fisherman nodded. "Then embrace the waiting. Learn from it. Let it shape you. God does not delight in delay, but he desires that you be strong enough to hold what he gives. Prosperity goes beyond money." The waves lapped at their feet as the fisherman continued. "What you seek is not just provision, but purpose. God's blessings are not merely for comfort, but for calling. Wealth without wisdom becomes a trap, but prosperity given in due time serves not just the receiver, but the world." The young man felt something shift within him. The waiting was not a prison, but a workshop. Every trial, every moment of patience, was forging him into a steward rather than merely a recipient. The final result. The fisherman placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "When the time comes, you will see. What you receive will be greater than gold, because you will have become greater than you are now." The young man inhaled deeply. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and promise. He had come seeking answers and had found something greater, a reason to trust. As he walked away, he no longer questioned the waiting. He embraced it, knowing that God was not withholding, but preparing him for something beyond his imagining. And in that moment, the waiting no longer felt like delay. It felt like destiny. You are chosen. The divine call beyond human eyes. Ethan had always felt invisible. In a world that rewarded the loudest voices and the strongest hands, he was neither. A quiet man with little to his name, he spent his days working the fields outside the city, his hands calloused from labor, his heart weary from waiting. He had no grand title, no remarkable talent that set him apart. If the world had a stage, he was merely a shadow behind the curtain. But God does not see as men see. One evening, as Ethan rested beneath an ancient olive tree, an old man approached. His robes were worn, his eyes piercing. "You have been chosen," the stranger said. Ethan laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Me? Chosen for what? I am neither a scholar nor a warrior. I have no wealth, no name worth remembering." The old man smiled. Neither did David when he was called from the fields. The words struck him like thunder. David, the shepherd who became a king, the boy overlooked by his own father but anointed by God. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a whisper that had long been buried beneath years of doubt. "God does not measure worth as men do," the stranger continued. "You see only what is in front of you, your struggle, your insignificance. But God sees the unseen. He sees faith where others see failure. He sees potential where others see emptiness. And, when he chooses, no man can overrule it." The old man turned to leave, but before he disappeared into the dusk, he added, "Prepare yourself. Favor is coming. When the overlooked are called." Ethan's life did not change overnight. At least, not in the way he expected. There was no sudden rise to power, no miraculous transformation that made him a man of renown. But something had shifted. His hands, once burdened with toil, now worked with renewed strength. His heart, once heavy with doubt, now carried an unexplainable peace. He began to see his labor not as mere survival, but as preparation. He started waking before dawn, tending his fields with purpose. The work was the same, yet everything felt different. One day, a merchant passing through the village stopped at his land. "I have never seen crops so full, so abundant," the man marveled. "How do you do it?" Ethan shrugged. "I do what I have always done." The merchant offered him a price far beyond what he had ever earned. It was the first of many unexpected blessings. Word spread. More buyers came. His fields prospered in ways that defied explanation. What once barely sustained him now overflowed. People in the village began to take notice. "How did this happen?" they asked. "Why is he favored?" They did not see the long years of labor in obscurity. They did not hear the whispered prayers in the lonely nights. They did not know that before the blessing, there was faith. The signs of being chosen. God's calling does not come as the world expects. It does not arrive with trumpets or grand announcements. Often, it begins in the unseen places, in the persistence of faith, in the endurance of trials, in the quiet conviction that you are made for more. Ethan had been chosen, not because of status or strength, but because he was willing. Willing to trust when nothing made sense, willing to prepare when no opportunity seemed in sight, willing to believe that God's plans stretched beyond his understanding. Like Joseph, sold into slavery yet destined for a throne. Like Ruth, a foreigner whose faithfulness led her into the lineage of kings. Like Peter, an uneducated fisherman who became a cornerstone of the church. To be chosen by God is to be seen when the world does not see, to be prepared for blessings that others cannot explain, the divine favor that follows faithfulness. Ethan did not become a king. He did not lead armies or perform miracles, but he became a testimony, living proof that when God calls, he provides. His fields flourished. His name, once forgotten, became known in the land, not for his power, but for the undeniable favor upon him. It was not just about wealth or success. It was about purpose. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer waiting for permission to believe he had a place in God's story. And neither are you. If you feel unseen, if you feel like your labor is in vain, remember, David was in the fields when he was called. Joseph was in prison when he was promoted. Esther was an orphan before she was a queen. The world may overlook you, but God never does. You are chosen. Prepare yourself. Favor is coming. The gold in the fish's mouth. James sat alone in his small cottage, his weary eyes fixed on the stack of bills before him. Each paper seemed like an accusation, a reminder of the crushing weight of his financial troubles. His hands, stiff with worry, moved slowly across the table as he scanned the numbers. Numbers that mocked him. No matter how hard he worked, it never seemed enough. And yet, despite all his prayers, despite his belief in a God who provided, James couldn't help but wonder, was God truly aware of his struggle? The doubts gnawed at him. Where was the provision? Where was the miraculous help that he had heard about in the stories of old? His faith, which had once been a steady flame, now flickered in the gusts of worry. Perhaps he had been forgotten. That night, as the wind howled outside his window, James opened his Bible. His eyes fell upon a passage that had always intrigued him. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. The words seemed to leap from the page, as if God was speaking directly to him. A coin in the mouth of a fish? Could this really be how God worked? Could the same divine provision be available to him, in his humble cottage, in his day of need? The next morning, James set out for the marketplace, determined to find work, to do whatever he could to ease his burdens. The morning sun had barely risen when he arrived. He asked around, but there were no jobs available. His heart began to sink once more. But as he turned to leave, a merchant's voice called out to him, "Hey, you there!" The merchant, a stocky man with a red face, waved him over. "I need a hand unloading grain. It's heavy work, but I'll pay you well for the day's effort." James nodded eagerly, his heart lifting. "I can help. I'll work hard." The day was long and grueling. The heat of the sun bore down on him as he unloaded sack after sack of grain from the merchant's cart. His muscles ached, his hands blistered, but he pushed through. As the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting a golden glow over the marketplace, the merchant approached him with a small leather pouch. "You've worked well," the merchant said, handing him the pouch. "You've earned your pay, and a little more for your efforts." James took the pouch with gratitude, his heart swelling with hope, but as he opened it, his eyes widened in astonishment. Inside was not just the promised pay, but a single gold coin, shining, heavy, and far more than he could have expected. "Where did this come from?" James asked, his voice a mixture of awe and confusion. The merchant chuckled, his face broadening into a grin. "A fisherman paid me with that today. Said he found it in a fish's mouth. Odd story, but I thought it was a good omen." James' mind raced as the words of Jesus echoed in his memory. "Take the coin from the mouth of the fish." It was no coincidence. This was no mere chance. This was God's provision, delivered in the most unexpected way. The gold coin, shining in the light of the setting sun, seemed to speak directly to his heart. God had not forgotten him. His prayers had not gone unheard. The provision James so desperately needed was not far off. It was already on its way, and it had come, just as the scripture promised, in a form he could never have imagined. That evening, as James walked home, the weight that had burdened him for so long seemed lighter. It wasn't just the gold coin, though that certainly helped, but the peace that now filled his heart. He had seen God's hand in his life, felt it in the very air around him. God had already set provision in motion. His financial struggles were known, and God had prepared a way forward, even if it had taken the most unexpected form. James realized, as he made his way back to his cottage, that this experience would change him forever. In the weeks that followed, he found his circumstances shifting in ways that he could not explain. New opportunities for work, unexpected gifts from old friends, and even moments of divine intervention that left him in awe. His faith, once shaken, was now stronger than ever. God had proved that his provision was not just a distant concept, but a very real and present help. In times of need, God will always provide. Not necessarily in the way we expect, but at the perfect time. Sometimes it comes through promotions, opportunities, or even the kindness of strangers. And sometimes it comes through the most extraordinary means, like a coin from the mouth of a fish. And for James, as he looked at the gold coin, he knew that his heavenly Father had not only seen his need, but had already provided. The weight of worry lifted from his shoulders and his heart filled with peace. God had spoken to him in a way that he would never forget. He was not alone, he was never forgotten, and God's provision, in its perfect timing, was always just around the corner. The silence of mockers, a tale of divine vindication. Eliab had always laughed at his younger brother. From the time they were boys, he dismissed David's dreams as childish fantasy. A shepherd will always be a shepherd, he would say, watching David play his harp beneath the vast Bethlehem sky. Even when Samuel anointed David as king, Eliab's skepticism did not waver. He was the first to sneer when David dared to face Goliath. "You, a mere boy? Go back to the sheep," he scoffed. But David did not answer his brother. He answered the call of God. Years passed, and the boy who once stood alone in a valley, armed with nothing but a sling and faith, had become Israel's greatest king. The name of David was now sung in the streets. The throne was his, and the very people who doubted him now sought his favor. Even Eliab, once his fiercest critic, bowed before him. The mocker had been silenced. This is the way of the Lord. He lifts the humble and confounds the proud. Those who once doubted you will bear witness to your triumph, not because you seek their approval, but because God delights in exalting those who trust in him. Consider Joseph, the dreamer. His brothers, filled with envy, threw him into a pit, sold him as a slave, and assumed they had buried his destiny. Yet when famine struck the land, they found themselves standing before Pharaoh's right hand, the very brother they betrayed. They did not recognize him at first, for God had transformed the prisoner into a prince. Their laughter had turned to silence. Then there was Hannah. Year after year, her rival Peninnah mocked her barrenness. She taunted her with cruel words, parading her own children as proof of God's favor. But Hannah did not answer Peninnah with anger. She answered with prayer. And when the Lord blessed her with Samuel, the prophet of Israel, Peninnah's mockery faded into obscurity. And let us not forget the greatest vindication of all: the empty tomb. The Pharisees, the Romans, the scoffers at the cross. They all believed that death had won. They thought they had buried the Messiah. But on the third day the stone was rolled away, and Christ emerged in glory. Your life is no different. There will always be those who doubt you. They will laugh at your dreams, scoff at your faith, and dismiss your trust in God as foolishness. But the Lord is faithful. If He has given you a vision, He will bring it to pass. Your success is not about wealth or status. It is about proving the power of God in a world that refuses to believe. One day those who mocked you will see the hand of God upon your life, not because you seek revenge, but because God's blessings cannot be hidden. When He pours out favor, it overflows. When He lifts you up, no man can pull you down. And when He speaks, the voices of the mockers are drowned in silence. So stand firm. Trust in the Lord, and when the time comes, walk boldly into the destiny He has prepared for you. The doubters will watch, the skeptics will witness, and the name of the Lord will be glorified. For He is the God who turns prisoners into princes, shepherds into kings, and mockery into silence. The abundant gift of His love. Elijah sat by the edge of a small stream, watching the water ripple gently over the smooth stones. The sun was setting behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the land. He had been thinking a lot lately about his work, his family, and the struggles they faced. The village was poor, and even though Elijah worked tirelessly, it never seemed enough. Bills piled up, and his heart grew heavy with worry. He had faith in God, but the silence of heaven weighed on him. As he sat there, a thought crossed his mind. Had God forgotten him? He had read in the scriptures about God's abundant love and provision, but where was it now? Where were the blessings promised to those who trusted in Him? Elijah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw his old friend Isaac approaching. Isaac was the village baker, a man known for his wisdom and quiet faith. Elijah rose and greeted him, and they sat together by the stream. "What's troubling you, Elijah?" Isaac asked, sensing the heaviness in his friend's heart. Elijah sighed. "It's the money, Isaac. No matter how much I work, There's always something more to pay. I feel as though I've been forgotten, as though the promises of God are for others, but not for me." Isaac smiled gently, his eyes full of understanding. "You know, Elijah, there's something I've learned about God's blessings over the years. It's not just about wealth in the way the world sees it. God's love is evident in many forms, not just in material things. Have you ever considered that God's provision might come to you in ways you haven't yet seen?" Elijah looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Isaac leaned back against a tree, his voice soft but steady. "I'll tell you a story. Many years ago, when I was struggling just like you, I too wondered where God's provision was. I worked long hours at the bakery, and yet the bills mounted. One evening I prayed to God, asking for His help. I remember saying, 'Lord, I trust you, but where is your blessing?' That night I had a dream. In the dream I saw myself sitting at a table full of bread. I didn't see riches, but I saw the joy of sharing with others. I realized that wealth isn't just about money, it's about purpose, fulfillment, and knowing that God's love is behind everything we have." Elijah's heart stirred. Isaac continued, "God desires to bless His people, Elijah, not just with money, but with joy, security, purpose, and fulfillment. You are not forgotten. The abundance you seek is already here, in the blessings that God has given you." As Elijah listened, something deep inside him shifted. He remembered the words of Jesus in Matthew 6:33. "But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." Maybe he had been focused too much on the wrong kind of wealth, the kind the world valued, and had overlooked the gifts that God had already given. Isaac's voice broke through his thoughts. "Trust in God, Elijah. When you are faithful, when you trust Him with your whole heart, He will bring abundance. Sometimes that abundance is financial, sometimes it's peace of mind or a sense of purpose. But it always comes. In the end, God desires that you experience not just material wealth, but a deeper, richer fulfillment." The next morning, Elijah awoke with a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in weeks. He went to the market as usual, but this time with a different mindset. As he passed through the bustling streets, he was struck by the beauty of the world around him. The vibrant colors of the market stalls, the laughter of children playing, and the kindness of familiar faces. He realized that his life was already filled with abundance in ways he hadn't truly appreciated. Later that day, a wealthy merchant approached him with a business proposal. The merchant had heard of Elijah's skills as a carpenter and wanted to commission him for a large project. The payment offered was more than enough to cover all of Elijah's debts. But even more than the material provision, Elijah felt a deep sense of joy and fulfillment. It was as though God had not only provided for his needs, but had opened a door to a new chapter in his life, a chapter filled with purpose and peace. That night, as Elijah knelt to pray, he offered thanks to God. He had learned something profound. Wealth, in all its forms, was not merely a sign of material success, but a sign of God's care. It was a sign that God desires to bless His people not just with riches, but with everything they need: joy, security, purpose, and fulfillment. And as Elijah felt the warmth of God's love surround him, he understood that the true wealth was found in trusting God and being faithful in all things. The king's treasure. John had always thought of himself as a simple man. He lived quietly, worked hard, and kept to himself. But deep within him was a longing for something greater. It wasn't that he was dissatisfied with his life, but there was an unshakable feeling that he was meant for more. Every day he prayed to God, asking for guidance, and each day he wrestled with the idea that perhaps mediocrity was all he could expect. One afternoon, while walking along the edge of a quiet forest, John found an old map tucked between the pages of a forgotten book in his local library. The map was worn and faded, but it clearly pointed to something extraordinary, a treasure hidden deep in the mountains. The legend attached to the map spoke of a king's inheritance, a treasure not just of gold and jewels, but of power, wisdom, and prosperity that would transform the life of any who discovered it. As he studied the map, something stirred within John's heart. Could this treasure be real? Was there more to life than the daily grind? Could he too inherit something greater than his current reality? He had always thought that perhaps wealth and greatness were for others, kings, heroes, or the fortunate few. But what if this inheritance was meant for him? John set out on his journey, and as he traveled he recalled the words of Scripture. "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." Psalm 24:1. The Creator of the universe, who had made all things, had a plan for his children, a plan of prosperity and abundance, not just survival. John had heard the stories of how God had blessed his people, from the wealth of Solomon to the promises made to Abraham. Could this promise be for him as well? After many days of travel, John finally reached the foot of the mountains. As he climbed, the terrain grew steeper and more treacherous, but his resolve did not falter. He had come this far, and he knew he could not turn back now. Each step forward seemed to echo in his soul. He was not simply seeking treasure, he was seeking his inheritance, something that had been promised to him long before he had even known of it. As he reached the summit, he came upon a magnificent stone temple, ancient and majestic. Its doors were large, yet they were strangely unguarded, as though they had been waiting for him. With a steady hand, John pushed open the doors, and before him, in the heart of the temple, stood a golden chest. It shimmered in the light of the setting sun, and as he approached, the chest creaked open of its own accord. Inside the chest were not just material riches, but a scroll, ancient and pristine. John unfurled it, and the words were clear, as though spoken directly to him. "You are heir to a kingdom that is not of this world. Your inheritance is not limited by the world's standards of wealth or success. It is an inheritance of life in abundance, of peace that passes understanding, and a prosperity that will overflow into every area of your existence." The words struck him deeply. This was no ordinary treasure. It was the fulfillment of a divine promise. Prosperity, in the fullest sense, was his inheritance. Mediocrity was not God's plan for him. God had not designed his children to simply survive. He had created them to thrive. John realized that true wealth was not merely financial. It was spiritual, emotional, and relational. It was peace in the midst of chaos, joy in the face of hardship, and provision in times of need. As he stood there, the golden chest now closed, a wave of understanding washed over him. He wasn't meant to scrape by or live in the shadows. He was meant to walk in the light of his inheritance, to live with the confidence of a king, not as a beggar. The wealth of the kingdom wasn't just a possibility, it was a guaranteed promise, a right given to him as a child of the king. All the riches of the earth were at his disposal, not to hoard, but to bless others, to live abundantly, and to show the world that prosperity is the inheritance of all who trust in God. John returned to his village, not with gold in his hands, but with a new understanding of what it meant to live in the fullness of God's promise. He no longer saw himself as a mere laborer or a man of limited means. He was a son of the king, and his life, from that day forward, was marked by the prosperity that flowed from the riches of the divine inheritance that had always been his. For those who follow the path of the king, prosperity is not a distant dream. It is a reality, a spiritual right, and a guaranteed inheritance. Mediocrity is not God's plan. His children are meant to thrive, to live in abundance, and to step into the fullness of all he has promised. The divine hand. Trusting in God's plan despite jealousy. In the grand narrative of Scripture, there is a recurring theme that resonates across generations: the envy of success. When God's favor rests upon an individual, those around them may struggle to see the divine hand at work, and instead, their hearts fill with jealousy. Yet in these moments, when human resentment runs high, God's power is most evident, and his purpose unfolds in ways that transcend worldly understanding. Consider the story of Joseph, a young man who found himself the object of his brother's envy. Born the son of Jacob's old age and beloved above all his siblings, Joseph was gifted with a coat of many colors, a symbol of his father's love and favor. This, however, was a bitter pill for his brothers to swallow. Their jealousy burned as they saw Joseph's prosperity and dreams of greatness, dreams that foretold of a future where they would bow before him. "Do you intend to reign over us?" they mocked. Will you actually rule us? Genesis 37:8. Their bitterness festered, leading them to plot against him. Joseph was sold into slavery, a victim of the very envy his success had incited. In this moment, it seemed as though Joseph's life had taken a tragic and irreversible turn. Yet what his brothers could not perceive was that this was merely the beginning of a much larger plan, one orchestrated by God's sovereign hand. As Joseph's life unfolded in Egypt, from the house of Potiphar to the depths of a prison cell, his success was nothing short of extraordinary. With each trial, God's favor was upon him, allowing him to rise in prominence even in the most unlikely circumstances. In time, Joseph became second in command over all of Egypt, a position from which he would ultimately save his own family and countless others from famine. His success, once envied and scorned, now stood as a testimony to the power of God's plan. It is here, in the full circle of Joseph's life, that we see the truth of God's providence. Those who resent the success of others, even when it is rooted in divine favor, fail to see the bigger picture. The envy of Joseph's brothers could not hinder the unfolding of God's will. In fact, it was through their jealousy that Joseph's path was directed toward a destiny that no one could have predicted or understood at the time. Joseph himself, now in a position of power, recognized the divine purpose that had been behind his suffering. When he confronted his brothers years later, he could have chosen revenge, but instead he spoke words of grace. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." In this moment, the power of God's plan became unmistakably clear. Jealousy in its many forms will always rise up in the face of prosperity. People will envy your success, question your motives, and doubt the legitimacy of your achievements. Yet, as we see in the life of Joseph, success that is rooted in God's plan cannot be thwarted by human jealousy. The very people who sought to undermine him were used by God to fulfill his greater purpose. What man intends for harm, God repurposes for good. This divine principle holds true not only in the pages of Scripture, but in our own lives as well. Whether in our personal relationships, professional endeavors, or spiritual journeys, we will encounter moments when others, sometimes even those closest to us, will question our success or resent our blessings. It is in these times that we must remember the truth of Joseph's story. God's plan is not dependent on human approval. His purposes will unfold in their due time, and the evidence of his power will be undeniable. As we trust in God's plan, even in the face of jealousy or opposition, we must remember that success is not simply about personal achievement. It is about aligning our lives with the divine purpose and allowing God to work through us for the greater good. In the end, it is not our own strength or wisdom that brings about success, but the unfathomable power of God at work in and through us. The story of Joseph invites us to trust in God's timing, to remain faithful in the midst of adversity, and to recognize that jealousy and resentment are but fleeting obstacles in the grand scheme of his eternal plan. What others intend for harm, God can use for good, and in this truth we find both comfort and hope. So, when the envy of others threatens to overshadow your progress, remember that God's plan is not thwarted by human resentment. His power will shine through, and his purpose will be fulfilled, revealing his glory to all who are willing to see. Trust in his plan, for it is far greater than anything jealousy can ever diminish. The refining fire. Elias stood at the edge of the worn-out path, his eyes tracing the hills that stretched before him. For years he had walked this rugged road, each step feeling heavier than the last. The wind whispered against his ear, carrying the faint scent of the coming storm. He paused, thinking back on the long and weary journey that had brought him to this place. His heart, once full of hope, had grown weary. The struggles had seemed endless, and at times even his faith wavered. The trials of his life had not been kind. There had been years of drought, his crops failing time and again. His family had known hunger, and Elias had worked tirelessly, pushing himself past the point of exhaustion. There had been moments when he questioned everything. Why had God led him to this road? Why had these hardships been placed before him? But as he stood there, watching the clouds gather above the distant hills, a thought struck him. The trials he had endured were not in vain. He remembered the words of the psalmist, "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God was near. Elias recalled the story of Job, a man who had endured unimaginable suffering. Job's friends had mocked him, questioning his faith, but Job had remained steadfast, and in the end, when his trial had passed, he was rewarded beyond measure. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. Job's struggles had not been without purpose. They had been the crucible in which his faith had been refined. As Elias continued down the path, he felt a stirring in his soul. He was not alone. His hardships had shaped him, refining his character, strengthening his resolve. He had been prepared for something greater, though he could not yet see it. His faith had grown, though sometimes it felt as if it were a flickering candle in the midst of a storm. But it was there, and in that moment he realized that his endurance had not been in vain. Later that evening, as Elias sat by his small fire, a stranger appeared on the horizon, walking steadily toward him. The man's gait was sure, and his face bore an expression of peace. As the stranger came closer, Elias greeted him. "You walk a long road," the stranger said, his voice calm but strong. "What brings you so far?" Elias sighed. "I have walked many roads, faced many trials, but the way has grown hard. I do not know if I can go on." The stranger sat beside him. "The road is hard for all who walk it, but you must remember that your struggles are not in vain. They are shaping you, preparing you for the blessings that await. Your faithfulness, though tested, will be your reward." Elias looked at him, wondering if the stranger knew his story. But before he could ask, the man spoke again, his voice like a balm to Elias's weary heart. "Remember the words of Isaiah, for I am about to do something new. See, I have already begun. Do you not see it? I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland." Isaiah chapter 43 verse 19. God has already begun to work in your life even when you cannot see it. He is moving on your behalf. The words resonated deep within Elias, and for the first time in many years, a flicker of hope kindled in his heart. Could it be true? Could the end of his trials bring something greater, something beyond his wildest dreams? He had believed it once, before the suffering had taken root in his soul. But now, with the stranger's words ringing in his ears, he began to wonder. "Your struggles have been the fire in which you were refined," the stranger continued. "Like gold tested in the furnace, your faith has been purified. The blessing that awaits you is not far off." As the fire crackled before them, Elias realized that this moment was not by chance. The stranger's presence was no accident. God had sent him as a messenger, a reminder that the path he walked, though difficult, was leading him towards something greater. In the days that followed, Elias's life began to change in ways he had not expected. New opportunities arose, work he had long sought, crops that began to thrive once more, and a peace that he had not known for years. The storm that had seemed to linger in his soul began to clear, and for the first time in a long while, Elias felt the warmth of the sun on his face. He understood now that the hardships were never pointless. They had shaped him, prepared him, and had made him ready for the blessings that were to come. His faithfulness, though tested, had borne fruit. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. And so, Elias walked on, no longer weighed down by the past, but filled with hope for the future. He knew now that all his struggles had been necessary, for they had led him to the place where God's blessings could finally find him.